Hello everyone. Don't be scared. I'm just loud. Great to see you all here. We're at the top of the hour. I see we have a lot of old friends, a lot of new friends. So let's get this started because we have done one of the worst things one can do as co-chair, and that is completely jam-pack the agenda with exciting presentations and did not say no to anything. So let's at least try to get everything in because we have a lot of exciting things coming up. And let's see if these slides are working. Excellent. So in case you didn't know, you are here at the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group as part of the IRTF. Today is the 28th of March and it is 1 o'clock. And I am one of your co-chairs. I'm Niels ten Hoever, and co-chairing with me is Avri Doria, who is not here in person, but who is with us in the, on MeetEcho.
I am.
You see. Excellent. Great to have you, Avri. So the administrivia, let's first see who is willing to volunteer to take the notes. This is going to be a very long, awkward silence. You can cut it short. Excellent. Thank you very much, dear sir. Who is willing to relay questions and conversations on Jabber? Thank you. No awkward silences. This is going really well. For the administrivia, address of the mailing list, GitHub, MeetEcho, minutes, and the introduction website can be found here on the slides. As said, we have a full agenda. We have a Jabber scribe. We have a note taker. Let's do some agenda bashing. Anyone would like to add something to the agenda? That would be Folter. No? Thank you very much. So let's go ahead. This is the note well. Please note it well. If you do not know it, please take close care. Inform yourself about the obligations. And as you all know, our work here, but in the IRTF and IETF at large, depends on your reviews. We get better documents out if you get better reviews. So for every document you write, at least review 2, and actually just review at least 2 documents before you go to a meeting. So the research group, we've been going at this for a while. So the first draft about this idea came out in October 27, 2014. And we presented that at IETF 91 at the SAG meeting in Honolulu. And we've come pretty far since then and had a lot of sessions, a lot of documents, but we will update you on the status of the documents later on. So what we're doing here is expose the relation between protocols and human rights, to propose guidelines, and to increase the awareness in both the human rights community and the technical community on the importance of the technical workings of the internet and its impact of human rights. So it goes both ways. So without further ado, we're going into our first presentation, and that is of Francesca Musiani, who will tell us more about distributed architectures and rights. Francesca is associate professor in Paris, and she will further introduce herself. Francesca, please come in.
Hello. Sorry. Can you see me and hear me all right?
We hear you, but if you are a big blue pixel, now we see you also fully. Excellent.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning, early afternoon for you, everyone. Late evening for me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much, Niels, for the invitation. So if I got it right, I have about 10 minutes, so I will try to be as brief as possible, but still clear about some research directions that, well, my medium long-term research by now on the social and legal implications of distributed architectures has led me to. So as Niels mentioned, I'm an associate research professor with the French National Center for Scientific Research. So it's basically the main public research institution in France. And my research explores several facets of internet governance, but with a particular focus. I am interested in which infrastructures and architectures of the internet may be used as governance instruments of governance, or to some extent can embed values, or can have yes, can be used for political reasons at large. Political intended as very much as large. So. I have especially worked on the issue of distributed architectures beyond their technical implications on the ADAM project. It's an acronym for, in French, Distributed Architectures and Multimedia Applications. It ran from 2010 to 2014. And but I have kept on working on this issue of distributed and decentralized architectures up to today, and currently I am involved in a European project called Next Leap that basically seeks to merge end-to-end encryption and decentralization. To go back to the ADAM project, we have explored for these 4 years how the choice by developers and engineers of internet-based services to go for a distributed architectural choice has implications for users in a number of respects. First and foremost, how it affects their rights. So. We have been asking questions such as the centralization of the internet and most recently the surveillance successes that it appears to be related with. What effects does it have for things such as user autonomy and empowerment and of course privacy? So right at the start of our project, Philippe Aigrin, a philosopher and computer scientist, some of you may be familiar with, suggested that distribution and decentralization were a way to reclaim internet services. So basically, he was making the argument that they are instruments of technical governance to some extent that are able to reconnect with perhaps an earlier organization of cyberspace. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our approach to distributed architectures was mainly a social and legal one. Like for the most part, our team was of social scientists and jurists. And what we observed was that distributed architectures were framed very much in the within the opposition between piracy and sharing. So very much from the perspective of some specific uses that were made of it, and especially from the standpoint of law, this was obliterating to a large extent a whole galaxy of things that were happening in parallel, and that were an interesting way to observe how visions, implementations of alternative internets were actually taking place. So experiments of governance by architecture, which could be imbued with different ways to distribute authority, power, perhaps a different way of organizing communities and of attributing value to the output of those communities. Next slide, please. So since then, obviously, well, when we applied for this funding, it was a matter of almost 7 years ago now. So most recently, we can also observe a few more things that have entered the picture, I would say. So it seems to us that post Snowden, distributed architectures have become perhaps more strictly linked to discussions of surveillance and privacy issues, and they have come to be more frequently associated to discussions about encryption in this frame of providing suitable alternatives to platforms that may have gone far lower in the trust of users than they used to, and so as an alternative vision and an implementation of principles. Similarly with communities such as those born around wireless community networks and mesh networks and the like, they are increasingly seen as technologies of increased user autonomy, of increased user empowerment and liberation. And at the same time, because of other narratives, there is still this this vision lingering of technologies that are used by like unsavory groups of people, and when it comes to encrypted technologies, that they are also, well, associated very much so in France, for example, with terrorist activities, and finally, of course, when it comes to public discourse on distributed architectures, now the blockchain has a very large place, so we can discuss about this. I'd be very interested to know what you think. For me, with the exception of Bitcoin, my impression is that courses on blockchain quite a lot about the anticipation of intermediary-less futures than a lot of fully working applications by now. But as mentioned, I haven't any like systematic research that supports claims. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Next slide, please. Coming. Thank you. So in this project, we have come to identify 4 areas of reflection on distributed architectures that I don't have time to present like all of them in detail here, but I can send the link to a piece that introduces a special issue that we have recently got out with my colleague Cécile Méadel. Okay, I am disabling video because I'm told that I don't have enough bandwidth. It is probably the case. I hope it's better this way. Sorry about that. So basically, what we have identified as issues worth of further research from a social and legal perspective when it comes to distributed architecture are first the importance of adopting a historical perspective and to build on the lessons learned that we can have not only from the early days of the internet, but also from the cycles that have arguably happened in terms of popular distributed architecture supported applications at different points in history, and to build upon these experiences. The second point is that, of course, this, especially from social, economic, legal perspectives, the very large heterogeneity of applications that subtend that are subtended by these architectures, and so we must do our best to try and map out in as accurate a manner as possible this heterogeneity, because it reflects on different collectives, different types of rights and norms that can be enacted, and so on. At the same time, the third aspect, the question of user empowerment. So we notably the opposition between individual and collective actors is very much questioned by these architectures, and it's a crucial question to examine. And finally, of course, this held a very large part on the project. The the questions of how law, responsibility, and authority are redistributed or can be redistributed by these architectures is of particular interest, because it can change in things such as like redefining the notions of creator and redistributor. It can affect the status of personal data, can affect the type of responsibility of technical intermediaries, and so on. Next and final slide, Niels. Thanks for the warning. Just to give a quick overview of recent interdisciplinary efforts that I'm aware of or involved in this field that incorporated the social and legal perspective. A number of European projects, mostly within the collective awareness platforms program. I'm currently involved in two of them. One of them heavily, Next Leap, that I was mentioning, and the other one, Net Commons, which is about wireless community networks. And the European Commission has recently got out a call that is more specifically about distributed architectures and their link with governance. This is it. I think there is one more slide that would basically conclude about. I have been very fond of this citation by Phil Ager for a long time, about architecture being politics but not being a substitute for politics, and the present time seems very much an illustration of this point. We see the different normative systems entangle, disentangle, try to respective places, and this has implications for how internet governance unfolds in our times. Thank you. The very last slide should have all my contacts, and I'll be looking forward to your questions right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for this. Discussing the politics of protocols is one of the favorite pastimes of this research group. I would like to invite people to the mic line if people have questions for Francesca. And while people are queuing up, I'd like to ask you, at the same time, you might observe more developments on wireless community networks and developments on mesh networks. We also see that work here in the Global Access for the Internet of All research group here in the Internet Research Task Force. But at the same time, you also see consolidation, for instance, in content distribution networks. So how would you sketch the trends of distributed architectures, or is that different on every layer, on every level?
Well, I guess that I'm a little biased by the fact that I am supposed to investigate a few specific ones. So, for example, like my perception of the, I have spoken briefly about my perception of the blockchain debate. Like right now, if I say that I'm working on distributed network architectures, 9 people out of 10 would say, oh, does it have something to do with the blockchain? So I would say that if the main trend is probably this one being the current buzzword, perhaps. At the same time, within the research, so the Net Commons project is in between research and activism, in the sense that it is meant by document of work to provide recommendations for sustainable governance of these communities for the close future in Europe, so in that respect, it does look like, in my opinion, the next step is to is for institutional politics to acknowledge such movements in a more complete way, perhaps, and not consider them as like grassroots oases or islands that are to be left alone and doing their own thing, but as something that can constitute an empowering alternative and something that could arguably be supported at the institutional level.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I think the time for this is up. I see people standing in the back of the room. Could everyone who has a free seat next to them raise their hand? So plenty of free seats. Please come and populate. Francesca, thank you so much. There are no people at the mic now, and our time for you is unfortunately up. I hope we can continue the discussion on the mailing list. Thanks so much for your presentation. Sure. And feel free to continue to join our meeting remotely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye. So now, and we continue with another presentation, and that might be something that we might learn from, because there is a similar piece of work going on in another standards body, namely the IEEE, which is going on in parallel to what we are doing. It might have a bit of another topic and scope, but it might be good to see what's going on to ensure that we do not duplicate and learn what the best practices are. So, and we're happy enough to have John Havens, one of the leaders in this work, on the call, haven't we, John? John.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. We have John Havens on the call. John, take it away.
Awesome. Well, Niels and everyone, thank you so much for inviting me. Real pleasure to be here, at least remotely, and thanks very much. So I'll talk 10 minutes. I'll present. If there's time for questions, great. I'm the executive director of the program that Niels mentioned. He's also on one of our committees, which we're thrilled about. And it's called the IEEE Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations in Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems. Next slide, please. You can check out our website. We'll give you the URL afterwards. We're part of the IEEE Standards Association, our program. Next slide. So just as a quick introduction, we like using this phrase in our work, both for standards and the document we're creating called Ethically Aligned Design, by saying ethics is the new green. Next slide. The basic idea here is that 10 years ago, in one sense, sustainability was really about kind of the environment, where companies realized we need to take care of the planet better. And it's also a way for people to define their brand or their work, meaning it's a way to establish trust with your stakeholders or with your audience when you say, this is how we are taking care of the planet. Well, with the work that we're doing, which, as Neil said, I think really aligns with the work that you're doing, is this idea of how can we take better care of people in one sense. Sustainability of human mental and emotional well-being and human agency. A lot of times the issues of ethics, people tend to think of compliance or risk, and those things are certainly important. But a lot of the work that we're doing is more values-driven design, or a sense of what are end user or stakeholder values that you can actually identify in your work, which are especially relevant in terms of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, which so directly deal with our autonomy and intelligence. And this is a question, I wrote a book about this subject called Artificial Intelligence. And this is a question I always kind of ask myself in my work, which is, how will machines know what we value if we don't know ourselves? And it's a good sort of guiding principle to constantly be thinking from an introspection standpoint. With all these glorious technologies, it's also a great opportunity to sort of look within individually and societally and say, how can we create standards that reflect the sort of best of what we want to be? Next. This is the paper I mentioned called Ethically Aligned Design. You may not be able to see the subtitle, but the subtitle is A Vision for Prioritizing Human Well-Being in Artificial Intelligence and Autonomous Systems. And we mean that from kind of a literal sense. I know Niels and the great work that you do is very focused on human rights, which we fully support. And we're also very into, as it were, things like the OECD Better Life Index. How can you think beyond GDP metrics to quantify the value of what you're creating? It's especially important with AI. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So along with the paper ethically aligned design, we are tasked with creating ideas for standards that we can submit to the IEEE Standards Association. Anyone can actually submit ideas to IEEE SA, but in our case, we're sort of a innovation arm in the sense for IEEE, in the sense that our paper and our committees putting together the paper on a regular basis identify areas where they think standards should be created. Our initiative was launched last April, so we're really excited that these 6 working groups, which are now all approved, the first 4 are up and running. The last 3 that you can see here were just announced last week. If we have time, I can run through all of these. I'm letting the slide stick up here for a minute just so you can read some of them. I think most of them are pretty straightforward what they are. And the first one especially, I'll take a minute to talk about in some of the next slides coming up. Next slide, please. So P7000, which is the first working group that was approved. I'm working group chair of that. And there's a wonderful woman named Sarah Speakerman, who's the vice chair. She actually wrote the book you can see here in the upper left-hand corner called Ethical IT Innovation. I'm guessing in the audience here, you are all probably familiar with values-based design or things like values-driven design, etc. Work by amazing people like Helen Niesenbaum or Batya Friedman. I hadn't really known about this work up until 2 years ago, and oftentimes that to say, you know, how do you identify a value or ethics, that it could be somewhat esoteric and that it could be difficult to systematize or put into a process. Well, that's not the case in one sense, or in the sense of how we think it. So this is the work, one example of the type of work we're doing with P7000, which is if you pick a value that's common to people around the world. So for instance, privacy, as you can see in this top box, and then you pick a context for where that value will be lived out. So in this case, it's the idea of privacy via RFID in a shopping mall. And the logic here is if you were building something that had RFID technology in it, and then so on either side, you can kind of see privacy is the value, and then to the right is the context. So you could replace the word privacy with the word identity or any other value that you were thinking of. And then what you're seeing here is this idea of these protection goals. These are 4 protections, as it were, that end users really typically want with regards to RFID. They want to be informed of data collection. They want to have choice over it, et cetera, et cetera. And what this really shows is this sense of beyond ethics as usual. And by the way, ethics as usual is great. You know, things like codes of ethics, which helps users or members of a certain organization or society really identify with the values of that organization. That's great. This work is really a yes and to say, okay, but if you're building something like an RFID tool, then you also have to do more due diligence to understand their values or their ethics. And it's not about judging them. It's not a moral judgment about their values or ethics. It's about recognizing what they are so you can build products and services that have the opportunity to align to what those are. And again, going back to the ethics is the new green idea, when you can also identify their values and build to them, that also can be a market differentiator or a tool for innovation. Because for instance, in this picture, if you're building a product that had like a switch that could serve all 4 of those protection goals, and your competitor didn't have a switch, but just one setting, then you would provide more opportunities for more people who would want to buy the product. So that's an example of why it's valuable to business and to organizations today. Next slide. And that's it. Under 10 minutes, pretty sure, like 9 minutes 30. So there you go.
John, you're a lighting example. It's great. I'm very curious if people have questions for John. Questions, comments? Yes, I see a queue starting.
Yeah, Giovanni, it's at the end. No, I don't have a question, but I think this is very important, this value-sensitive design. I work with that as well during my PhD, and I think we also need to maybe start to think about teaching students about that. It's raising awareness about that, because until a point I was forced by my professor to go through the ethics commission of the university. I had no idea about those things. So I think a lot of people out there don't even know about it. I think that's one of the things probably we should work on too.
Thanks so much.
Joe from CDT. Excuse me. Wondering to what extent this is a very general exercise versus specific, excuse me, I've been sick, it's hard for me to talk, specific, much more narrowly scoped kinds of alternatives. So for example, where I work at CDT, we've built an interrogatory tool for people who are building machine learning algorithms to essentially accomplish what you're doing, but in a different way. But we did that because we figured that doing anything bigger would be like boiling the ocean. And so I'd love to hear what you think about in terms of scope for this effort, or is it intended to be sort of a very general layer on which people could plug in efforts like ours, and specific to machine learning, not to all autonomy?
Well, it's a great question. Also, I hope you feel better. Not being a machine learning expert, I will speak to our work, and hopefully it's applicable to you, which is, I think the general idea that, because also, I showed you one slide, that's one part of what will be a whole standard. And really the logic is a due diligence about asking these types of questions. We're hopeful, like even in the context of what you were saying with machine learning, there would be more questions to be asked than maybe right now are being asked. That's a really hyper simplification. But the logic is, typically when you think of ethics, a lot of times people sort of compare utilitarianism with like virtue ethics. And one particular person or one particular organization may subscribe to one versus the other methodology. Whereas what we're trying to sort of teach people is, when you have multiple applied ethics methodology tools, then it's really coming at the same question from 4 or 5 different angles. So in one sense, again, to use business sort of enterprise language, it's sort of agile marketing, but for ethics. Where to your point, it's tough because starting very general may not always be as effective depending on the application that you're working on. But if you start general, then hopefully you can identify, okay, we don't need to focus on these 3 or 4 areas of values elicitation, but we need to ask more questions about this area. So again, it's really like a due diligence process, but also, like I said, the innovation idea, where it's not just about saying what risks or unintended consequences do we want to avoid, but what questions can we ask that maybe could give more innovation to what we're building.
Thanks so much, John.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm wondering whether this approach sort of entails that designers of these systems need to embrace a strong ethical framework themselves in order to do any work. Because it strikes me that if you really are neutral about this, then you could have the problem that your technology could just as easily be designed in favor of, say, somebody who has the values of a tyrant, or somebody who has the values of suppression of speech or whatever, and those all seem to be considerations that you're going to have to think about. But if you're really going to be sort of take a neutralist stance about the value of these things and just sort of say, well, whatever, you have to take the ethical stance or the value stance of the potential consumer of this, then I mean, don't you have the danger of creating technologies that can be used in ways that maybe you wouldn't like so much? I mean, this has the flavor of the discussions around technology that happened after the Second War, and I'm just wondering how far you're going to go down that path.
Now, you bring up a lot of great issues. As I'm sure you're all you're all aware, ethics is not easy. So certainly don't want to make it sound like, hey, we've solved everything. Do some standards and we're good to go. You know, it's really complex. And this is also, I'm speaking in English from America, and I think it's mainly European audience there. And we're just starting to work now with a lot of wonderful Japanese, Korean, and Chinese experts. And so we haven't even talked to like Confucian ethics or Ubuntu ethics in Africa. I think first off, again, and not to harp on this, is at least in my experience when I was an EVP at a top 10 PR firm, and we had clients like Gillette and HP, for instance. And keep in mind, PR is also after products are built. But in PR, a lot of times the ethical work that you come up with are dealing with the unintended consequences when a company has released a product and something happens that's unexpected. Ethically, I'll just say unexpected versus maybe there was real malicious intent. My experience in those situations was it's also always easier to say what you should have done in the case of a crisis. But a lot of times I was always amazed at how many questions seemed to not have been asked about not just ethics, but safety and other aspects of values that then led to a crisis. So I'm not necessarily answering your question very well, but I think the point is when I see like where a lot of our work for P7000 is taking existing systems development lifecycle models, because there's a lot of great standards that exist already, and we don't want to replicate any of the great work being done by ISO or other groups around the world, is to say, where are there no ethical or no values-oriented language or questions in those great models? How do we start to introduce like value-sensitive design and values-driven design so that people start to be aware that these tools are out there? Because it's not a very empirical answer per se, but you know, where there is no sense, and by the way, I shouldn't say no sense. Of course, people have codes of ethics for their organizations, but a personal code of ethic for an individual building, you know, there's always going to be bias, etc. So when you have these other tools to examine or try to examine the values of others, then there's just more of a chance for more input to create data that you can create stuff that's hopefully going to align with the people using your products.
John, thanks so much. And me as a non-English speaker, maybe I can ask a clarification question, because what you seem to say is that we need to base ourselves on the values of end users, but I think we can find all possible values out there in the world. Does that mean we should align along all the possible values in the world, or is there a standard that we should set?
I think the point is that when you're building something for someone else, you do have to try to understand what their values are. Now, obviously, from an ethical standpoint, if someone's values are they like to kill people, then, you know, building your product or service to help them better kill people, that is an ethical issue. But I think, you know, this is somewhat hard because we're talking about these ideas in sort of a general open context where there's not really that situation. So for instance, if you're talking about RFID as a technology, you really need to say, well, what's the context of where it's going to be used? So like the example I gave, when you think about RFID being used in a mall, and then you ask, who is going to walk through the doors of that mall? Now, in the mall, based on where it's located, there will be laws that are already set in place that vary region to region, which also will speak to cultural aspects. But a European mall or a mall in the United States, now you have a much more specific context to think about this values elicitation and honoring process. And then the logic is, yes, you can build a tool that someone could still use in ways that you didn't intend, or that would be against the law. But in terms of on your side, trying to build to understand the values of that very specific contextual situation, that's oftentimes work that people don't do as much now, meaning they may say, let's build this cool RFID phone, and they build a great phone, but they don't build in, as I mentioned, those 3 or 4 different switches, as it were, to honor those different levels of protection around privacy. But when you say, we're going to build this cool phone with RFID, and one of the main places people are going to use it is at a mall, then you can say, well, a lot of people don't like, in terms of a value of privacy, their data being tracked. Now you have innovation in the sense of you discovered or identified something you really should build to, or at least in that mall, in that contextual place where you've probably figured that you're going to be selling to, then you wouldn't be providing the value that those users may want.
Thank you very much for that great answer, John. I'm going to cut the queue here because we still have 2 presentations and 2 drafts to discuss and an update on a draft, but not before we finish this. And I see there are people standing in the back, so can everyone raise their hand who has an empty seat next to them? So feel free to sit next to someone with a raised hand. And please, go ahead.
Hi, John. Thank you for this. I'm Ryan Polk, and I had a question. So you talked about looking at the use cases and determining the values for each of these use cases. With a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning, you're developing an algorithm that by nature can be trained to be used for thousands upon thousands of use cases. So how do you bring in values into when you're developing a machine learning algorithm that can be used in so many different cases?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, part of it would be sort of what is the first purpose that the algorithm is being built to do? Meaning, and this again is where I will, express ignorance about not being a programmer per se. So forgive me if I speak with bad context in that sense. But why are you building an algorithm? What is it intended to do? And yes, it can be used for thousands of different purposes, but who is the company that's building it? And what is their main purpose? So is it B2B? So business to business? Is it B2C? Is it business to consumer? Is there an aspect to it where, like a lot of the ethical questions beyond this one standard that we're working on with our larger work is to ask about questions of transparency and accountability. Not just is it a black box system, we maybe don't know what the algorithm is doing once it's been released or once it's doing its work. But if it does something that wasn't intended, is there a methodology and accountability or traceability to say now we know what it did? So, first of all, when you ask the question in a general sense, I guess I'd be saying, what would be the type of algorithm or company that's building it, just to get some context. But then it's a great question, and also the question of, this is not necessarily your question, but something we think about a lot, which is if you build an algorithm and you are an American roboticist or programmer, and I'll give the example of a robot. If you build a robot that has something that looks like eyes and something that looks like a face for its morphology, in general, in the United States, that robot, when it, quote, looks at you, would probably look into your eyes, because most Americans look into each other's faces when they speak. But if that same robot was going to be released in a lot of Asian communities, Japan, etc., there may be a tradition of not looking into people's eyes. That's a really simple example, and it's really more of a cultural question than an ethical one, but it does speak to values of the end user, in the sense of, again, the context of whatever the algorithm or product you're building, the context of the different places it's going to be released. Again, maybe this is not specifically what you asked, but you create the sort of main product, but then where is it going to be released? You really do need to think about those end user cases, or else you may build, in that case, you might offend someone, or they're probably just not going to buy it. And then that hurts, you know, your future sustainability as an organization.
Thanks so much, John, for this, for your work in this area and for your presentation here in HRPC. Unfortunately, we need to continue, but thanks very much. And feel free to stay on and be part of further discussion.
Thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. So without further ado, we are going into a completely other level of the discussion, but a relevant level nonetheless. And that's a presentation by Giovanni, who is our first presenter here in the flesh, which is great. His paper, No Domain Left Behind, is Let's Encrypt, Democratizing Encryption. Go ahead, Giovanni. Oh, here, there you go.
Thank you. Just before I started, don't hate me. I mean, probably most of you just saw the presentation in the other room, so I apologize for that. But I told Niels that I had also submitted to MapRG, and I think this is a valid presentation for this working group, because there's a lot of values that Let's Encrypt provides. So I'm not going to be focused on the same things that I focused there, but like on the values that this thing added. So, all right, I don't work for Let's Encrypt. I cannot speak for them. This guy was a game changer. Things after him have changed when it comes to security. There was a bunch of reactions after the revelations of an NSA. RFCs here in the IETF, cloud providers, mobile operators, developers as well, enabling encryption. And what happened in the end for the web traffic, we start to observe that 50% of current web traffic is actually encrypted. Yeah, the next slide. Yeah, well, right here. I'm going to point here. Yes, there you go. So this is telemetry data from both Google and Firefox, anonymously provided by the users automatically. So you see that 50% of the traffic is encrypted, which is a great thing, but still we can do better as a community. So we need to, you know, ultimately most of the traffic should be actually be encrypted to provide more privacy, security, and all other values that I also discussed in the draft of in the draft that's been discussed in this work group. And one of the problems to get encryption widely deployed on the web, it's you need a certificate, and they cost money and they're complex to obtain. You have to buy, depending on who you buy from, it would cost you like $100, and this cumbersome task actually to deploy that. And the goal of Let's Encrypt in this case was actually to tackle those obstacles and make sure you can get a certificate for free, and also to provide automation for you to configure your website with web encryption. Now, they have a protocol that's being standardized. If you want to take part in the discussion, feel free. I'm not involved either. There's a tool that actually implements this protocol for configuring the whole thing. Anyway, so we wanted to know if Let's Encrypt is actually democratizing encryption on the web by protecting people, and we did a measurement study on that. We just got the public logs of issues of certificates of Let's Encrypt and a bunch of other data sets that I'll do because of time, and we just skip that, but I will be talking about the results, which are more important. By the way, there's a full paper about that. If I'm going too fast, later you can download and check it out. So Let's Encrypt, like since from 2007, September 2015 through September 2016, that's the period we evaluate, 1 year of data. They have issued more than 10 million certificates for fully qualified domain names, and for over more than 4 million second-level domain names. It's a great thing. This is a public data, of course, and we're seeing a measure of adoption here. The interesting thing is that Let's Encrypt, it's used by 98% of the certificates issued for domains outside Alexa and 1 million. Alexa and 1 million is just a sample of the most popular and probably wealthier domains out there. They would have the resources and the money and the people and the skills to configure those certificates. So it turns out Let's Encrypt discovered the other people, which is a great thing too. But also, if you take like just a sample of Alexa and 1 million, let's say they want top 1,000, you see that like roughly 20% of them use at least one Let's Encrypt certificate in their subdomains. I don't mean like the main website, I mean the subdomains. So, which is a great thing. It works, it's cheap, and then other people, everybody else is using, which is good. And in this study, we also want to know which organizations are using Let's Encrypt. So we map those certificates into their IP addresses and therefore later into the organizations. And you can actually see that on the x-axis here, we have the organizations. In September 2016, we have like roughly 66,000 organizations that have issued those certificates. And you have some jumps here in the CDF. And there are 3 major jumps. And that means that in this case, 3 hosting providers were responsible for 47% of the certificates. These are big hosting providers like WordPress, there's OVH from France. And what they decided in one go was the following. We have a lot of users that uses our services. Most of them are like shared hosting, which is very cheap services, don't pay much. But because Let's Encrypt allow automation, let's provide security and privacy for all these people. Let's enable privacy and encryption for them in bulk for free. I think it was for free, I guess, for some of them. So they just did it, and you see those spikes here in the CDFs. And that's a great thing. I think that's a lesson we see of one technology, one tool, one project here that we can take for this working group. Is just see that, you know, if you have the right tools, the right incentives in place, you can have easily better security. So we also wanted to see which sorts of organizations are mostly using this. And of course, turns out to be hosting industry because, well, the certificates are mostly used for that. You can use it for other applications. And it turns out that they're mostly used by the per cousin of the hosting industry, which are the shared hosting people. It can have dedicated hosting and shared hosting. Shared hosting is the one you share over the same IP address, multiple websites, just to save costs. And these are people probably wouldn't have incentives to deploy encryption. And actually, by September 2016, the far majority of the certificates of Let's Encrypt were located in shared hosting. There's a paper that explains this methodology, how to map that. I'm not going to get into the details for the question of time. Probably skip that too. And another question that we wanted to answer, it's like, which kind of domains are getting Let's Encrypt certificates nowadays? It's domains that are new or old. And because I work for one registry, I could take a look at the age of the domains were issued Let's Encrypt certificates for. It turns out one hypothesis was like that. Well, the hosting providers are only going to enable for the new domains. They're going to have the new interface. They're going to click on the button and have this thing deployed automatically. But it turns out it's not the case. In the green line here, have the median and the quartile ages of the domains for every single month that we obtained that had Let's Encrypt certificates and were data now because they only had access. We had only access to that data. It turns out that some of the cases they have they're 8 years old. So we're seeing a lot of old domains out there using certificates that you probably didn't use before, and they start to use because it's for free, it's automated, and it's just simple to do it. And probably maybe their hosting provider decided to do. So again, a great lesson for us to learn here, as an example, not from me, but from them. This is also, we wanted to know, okay, they have issues of certificates, but they correctly deploy. And we just scanned 25,000 of those websites, those domains, and roughly 16,000 were correctly deployed. Many of them could have been used internally in the company, so we wouldn't be able to see, or the certificates could have been used for other applications, but it still is a very good number. So a lot of people the public internet are being protected by Let's Encrypt now. So to summarize, well, I think that's a major lesson. Let's Encrypt is a great success story here. Just by tackling security, cost and complexity, and having the right incentives and have the right, probably support and marketing as well. We did a great job. They are democratizing encryption by covering the low cost end of the market, but not only the low cost is using the top players are also using it. And automation works. That's maybe one key thing for security. And yeah, they started democratizing encryption. So we have a paper here, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Wow, thanks so much, Giovanni, for that great data. So people feel free to queue at the mic, and while people are queuing, I was very interested about the whether you know about whether the older domains already had certificates and they simply went for the cheaper option now, or whether they actually did not.
Yeah, that's a great question. We also wondered about that, but the problem, we didn't have this data beforehand, so you could. That's something we need to work on. But it's a great thing. Great question.
Ted Lemon. Yeah, so I just wanted to, it looks like you've actually thought about this too in your last bullet item, your use of malicious actors. I agree with you that this is a huge success story, but there are some some interesting lessons to learn, and one of the most obvious is that anything that's easy to use will immediately be used by people who are trying to do bad things.
Just like Tor.
Yeah, well, so we've seen these. Sorry, we've seen these PayPal, fake things, and so it's. I think I just wanted to mention that because in relation actually to the previous talk as well, that there are some real lessons to learn about this, and just because you intend a very good use for something doesn't mean that it's going to only have a good use.
Absolutely, it's like the same. Any good technology can be misused, and it's the same case for Tor network and the hidden services like the Silk Road. It's the same thing. It was intended for people for free speech. It's being used for drug marketing. But I personally believe, that's a personal belief, that just because it's being used by a certain minority of people, it shouldn't be banned. It should be incentivized. That's a price probably we have to pay for that.
Sarah Dickinson from Synodon. I really like this work. This is great stuff.
Thank you.
All I wanted to say was it seems very web-centric, and I understand why that is, but I wanted to make one comment, which is that in the DNS world, we're currently trying to deploy DNS over TLS. And I just looked at our experimental servers. We've got 9 of them, and 2/3 of them are using Let's Encrypt certificates.
Oh, that's great. That's great to know. Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, and the automation was a huge part of that, even though there's been a couple of hiccups with us getting it working. But that played a critical part, I think, in getting those servers up and running.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's great news. So another example of success, I guess.
Thanks so much for this great work, Giovanni. And my clicker back. Here we go. So, and finally, we go for a feel-good presentation because you are all suddenly bombarded to guardians of privacy by Adamantia Rogovica on her presentation of the paper Rethinking Privacy Online and Human Rights, the Internet Standardization Bodies as the Guardians of Privacy Online in the Face of Mass Surveillance. Adamantia, Mando, here you are. Great.
Can you
Come
hear
in,
me?
take it away. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for the invite. Hello from the Netherlands. I see that you left the lawyer for to be the last one, so that's a wise choice. Okay, so this paper is supposed to introduce the work of the IETF and a little bit the work of the research group to international lawyers. Because there is some discussion in law and technology, lawyers and scholarship, but international law and international lawyers so far, they haven't been discussing what you're doing. So what I will do today is that I'll just make a few points from the perspective of how international lawyers sees your work. And in turn, very briefly, how I think that your work, the IETF's work, could be used back to inform what we're doing in international law. Now, the paper discusses mostly, if not exclusively, privacy issues, but I will refer more generally to human rights. So main points today, first, internet standard setting is informal lawmaking. Second, informal international lawmaking, in this context, setting internet standards may not be legally relevant and, binding, but it can be legally and technically relevant. Technically relevant in the sense of what I call, at least, the IETF and human rights as technical issues, and legally relevant in the sense of what international human rights law can learn from the IETF. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the first point. Generally, law, international law, how do we know that we have law? It is being produced by a specific actor, following a very specific process, and we have a very specific fixed final outcome. Anything else that it doesn't follow this criteria and somehow it de facto regulates and is being followed by actors, including states, non-states, individuals, industry, it is what we call informal law. So in this sense, what the IETF is doing, in my eyes, in the eyes of international law, is informal lawmaking. So setting internet standards and making protocols, since it defines how the internet functions, and since it is a very strong regulatory force and adopted by relevant stakeholders, is informal lawmaking. And that's quite important. It doesn't make it legally binding itself, but it means that we should care about from the perspective of international law. Next slide, please. That's the second point. I was trying to be funny. So that's the topic of the IETF and human rights, which can create some tensions. Next slide. So from my own point of view, if I have to address very briefly the topic of IETF and human rights, I will raise 4 questions. The first question is the IETF bound by human rights? And that takes a very straightforward and clear answer. It is no. Human rights concern only the relationship between the state and individual. The second question, which is a different question, is a question of whether the IETF gets involved with human rights. And that's a yes and a no. So it's a no, because it does not have the mandate to make standards for or against human rights. This is, of course, my own view. There are other people supporting and arguing that the IETF should make standards for human rights. And at the same time, it's a yes, because internet standards, they do inevitably define to a great extent the level of human rights protection according to end users. The next question is whether it falls within the IETF's mandate to address and assess the impact of internet standards to the users, to the human rights of the users. And this is a question that, in my view, it triggers the IETF's mandate. The answer, according to my view at least, is that yes. If, and only if, the impact on the users, the impact on the human rights of the users is such that it is related to retaining the trust of the users to the network and making the internet function better. The typical example here is the example of mass surveillance and how the IETF perceived the mass surveillance and the serious threats to the user's privacy as an attack to the network, and it felt that it needed to defend the network against this attack. This example, it is privacy specific, but I think it can apply to a great extent to other human rights as well besides privacy. Next slide, please. And that's the 4th question. So if it does fall within the mandate of the IETF, how will or how should the IETF assess the impact of internet standards of its own work to human rights and to the users? Reading how informal lawmaking takes place in the IETF, I can clearly see that you do have one of the criteria to adopt an internet standard, and it precisely makes it very receptive to non-technical considerations. So is the process receptive? It is, because one of the criteria to adopt an internet standard is to assess the contribution of the standard to all affected parties and to the internet. Now, does this mean that the IETF will address and assess privacy or freedom of expression of user A in country X? In my view, no. It means that it will assess the possible impact of the standard to human rights, and that's quite different. And in this sense, I did find very interesting the work, I think it's still a draft, if I'm not mistaken, of by Mark Nottingham, a draft Hrpc, that you see the shift, the change in his first draft from values and human rights to process and the impact. In this way, when the IETF addresses human rights, it addresses them as technical issues. So it needs to tailor, it needs to translate human rights considerations and human rights into the mentality, into its own mentality and its own value system, so that it can be able to appreciate it and to take it into consideration when creating or updating internet standards. Next slide. So that was the first part. The second part, but I will keep it very brief. It has to do with you doing great work on how human rights should be taken into account into the IETF's work. But the question is, what do we do in international law? And I find it extremely interesting the fact that we can use the mentality and how the IETF appreciates certain values and somehow to translate them back to international law. So I think most of you know by now that when we talk inside the international human rights law box nowadays, we say that human rights are applicable online, Existing human rights obligations need to be respected by states. Mass or and/or indiscriminate surveillance may be interferes with the right to privacy and many other things. And these are all great and very important pronouncements, but they don't necessarily mean something. So what do they mean? Because if us lawyers, we don't understand what do they mean from a technical sense, from a practical sense, it's a bit pointless. So to give you an example, and we can change slide, please. So one example that it's very troubling for many lawyers. So in international law and human rights law, usually we think when we discuss privacy or we discuss freedom of expression or security, we conceptualize them in terms of being in conflict or being in tension or somehow being competing interests. And this is something that you can see in the very structure of the human rights law treaties. And we say that somehow we need to balance them. Nonetheless, when we're online and what we get, or at least I get from the technical perspective of privacy, the technical value of privacy, is that, well, privacy and freedom of expression and security, they can be in a mutual relationship. They can be into a symbiotic relationship. And that's a relationship that lawyers don't get because we're not trained like this. So it's very difficult for us to assess a possible human rights violation, and being able to say that, you know, privacy can actually be a precondition to security, to individual security, network security, or national security. And you can see these problems in, for example, the encryption debate. You can see that policymakers and lawyers, they don't get this thing. So it's very important how we'll be able in the future to translate it in terms of legal reasoning and how we make judgments and how we understand the interest at stake. I think I will stop here. Yeah, I usually show these slides, not this one, the next one especially, change the slide please, to law students and colleagues of mine. And when I explain them that, you know, even when we have a tension between privacy and freedom of expression or security online, they are in such interdependent relationship that we must be very careful. And it does take all of us some time to understand that. Anyway, I think that's it. Thanks. These are some other examples. I won't really go into them, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mando. You are quite funny for a lawyer. That's great.
Yeah, I'm
So
trying
we have a queue. Please come in.
Ted Hardy, thanks very much for your work. It's always interesting to see work that's attempting to bridge two different communities' understanding of a problem. I do have a couple of comments. One is in your use of the term mandate. I think the IETF has a technical scope, but because it makes voluntary standards, it does not have a mandate in the way many of our IGF colleagues would consider. In particular, if you asked who gave the IETF its mandate, we sort of give it to each other rather than it's deriving from someone else. We need standards of that type. The other point I was going to make in the relationship there, I've often found that lawyers understood this in terms that the law of the sea was a very good metaphor for them. And the explanation I've used in the past is a regulator might say, for example, that a particular shipping type needs a keel of 6 meters in order to be considered appropriate for intercontinental shipping. And that could be a regulatory statement of the regulator. But the technical work that would relate to that would be first determining what wave heights are, what keel depths actually created safety, and then subsidiary standards that says, okay, if you're going to build a harbor for ships of this kind, you must dredge at least 7 meters because you will have keels of 6 meters to deal with. We fall more onto the how deep do you dredge and how do the waves affect the keel side of things than the regulatory side. And it's useful for us to be informed of each other's work, but we have to be fairly careful of our scope because the technical impact of what we do, both of us, has safety implications and interdependencies, but they're very fundamentally different in ways that mean that we can't presume either that because we said something must be dredged this deep, that people are going to build keels appropriate to accommodate it. We have to react to the world as it comes to us. Nor should we fail to inform the people who are setting those standards if they're setting keel sizes that we think the waves will swamp. Once again, thanks very much for your work.
Yes, thank you. A lot of us are getting an education here. I'm Matt Mathis, and I want to make a couple of observations. First of all, I'm completely appalled at how many ways in which our protocols leak information in particular, and I consider this to be a technical bug. It's not really a regulatory issue, other than it's become important for us to think about it because of regulatory issues around the IETF. But some of these protocols just blatantly leak information. But at the end of the day, we have reasons to have lawful intercept. We have reasons to have lawful censorship, in particular things like malware. And the technologies that provide both of those things have no value intrinsic to them. And we don't control how they get used. That's fundamentally in a policy domain. So those two tools, and there's probably more, but those are the two that come to my mind, are building blocks that we should strive to provide in a robust way, that is, that don't have leaks and unintended behaviors. And that's a technical problem, and using them is something that needs to come from other places beside the IETF.
Can I reply? Can I make some comments in between?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
You got full mandate.
Yeah, very briefly. The mandate maybe was a little bit of an unfortunate use of term, but I think what I mean, and I think we all get, is whether the IETF feels that it's something that it should get involved into. And I think that in certain instances, it does feel that it needs to get involved. Now, I don't think that technology can solve everything, and I don't think that human rights or regulation or law can solve everything. And the last point is that I agree that, in the sense that I don't think that many of the issues that they're being posed by internet standards and the internet standard setting should necessarily be framed or seen in light of always of human rights. Or even if so, it doesn't mean that it's a particularly meaningful and useful exercise all the time.
I'm John Levine. When I look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's 30 articles, and the discussions I see here mostly concentrate on 2 of them. I mean, I see a lot of attention to freedom of expression and to privacy, but like Article 12 refers to attacks on honor and reputation, and Article 17 refers to arbitrary deprivation of property, that is to say theft. And what I see is, even when you're looking at human rights, there is a tension. I mean, the more the more you enable freedom of expression, the more you enable attacks on honor and reputation, which are a big deal in a lot of places. And to the extent people chafe at security stuff. I mean, a lot of this. I mean, I spend way too much of my time, working on security features which, although they are in some tension with some aspects of personal privacy, they also prevent all sorts of, they prevent people from having their bank accounts cleaned out. So what I'm looking for here is, where is the balancing of not just between rights and other things, but between rights that have sort of conflicting technical demands.
Thank you. Mondo, it would be great if you could tell us a bit about balancing indeed. And there I'm going to cut the queue to ensure we got the rest of the...
Yeah.
Mondo, go ahead.
Okay, so very briefly, human rights, they're not absolute concepts or absolute values. They have been designed to function within societies. And this means that they are subject to restrictions. All human rights, with the exception of one right that is not particularly relevant to our discussion, that's the prohibition of torture. All other human rights, they're subject to specific restrictions. These restrictions could be on the basis of specific state functions, like public order, public safety, public morals. or could also be on the basis of interest of other people. So in this case, you could have, for example, a tension or even a conflict between freedom of expression and privacy. How do we resolve this? We resolve this by the so-called balancing mechanism. So at some point, the judge, what needs to do is to, in light of the very specific circumstances of the case, to balance these two different competing interests and reach a specific outcome. That's the mechanism that we have in human rights law. In your work, for example, my understanding at least is that you have something similar, but it's not the same. When you design, you have trade-offs. It's not the same mechanism. It doesn't work the same way, but it's a bit similar in order to compare for the present purposes. What is, from a human rights law point of view, what I see intriguing is precisely that this balancing exercise, when we do it, we always have a priority. So depending on the very specific case that we're dealing, if it's a privacy case, so if you have a person, individual complaining of a violation of the right to privacy, you're going to have privacy as the rule, and then you're going to have as a possible exception, a possible restriction, for example, freedom of expression. And this is, in the specific case, it's something like a fixed hierarchy in the sense that it limits your leeway on how you're going to balance these two things, because they have this relationship of privacy, the rule, exception, freedom of expression. And when you try to take this, the human rights mentality, to apply it in cases when you have interest online, it's a little bit more complicated. It becomes a bit complex because you may have an instance that privacy could be a precondition to freedom of expression. And when this is the case, what do you do? So how do you balance? Is it the same way? Anyway, I think I will stop here. But I think the main point is that we do have this balancing exercise, of course, and human rights, they're not absolute concepts. And also to add that the fact that the IETF, in my view, should be human rights aware and possibly have specific guidelines assessing the impact of its work to human rights of the end users in specific circumstances. It does not mean that we're going to take all human rights that we have in all treaties, or that we need to do that. Specific human rights are relevant here, and I think we're talking about these specific human rights.
Thank you so much, Mando, for your paper, your presentation, and for your contributions on the list to the research draft. We're going to quickly continue now because we only have 15 minutes left for 2 drafts and an update and some next step discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.
So I'm quickly switching hats here from co-chairing to discussing a new draft. It's a draft on anonymity, and this has been a draft that came out of our last session, where we said we want to study whether anonymity is something we want to do in the IETF, and if so, what does it mean and on what level? So this is really just a rough framework that aims to break down the different meanings and implications of anonymity on a mediated computer network. The research questions are: how anonymous is the end user to the local network operator, other networks you connect to, and your communications peer on the other end of the pipe? Questions on linkability, on pseudonymity, the combination of protocols, and whether we could specifically formulate advice for protocol developers and implementers to improve anonymity and pseudonymity. That is roughly where we are with that document. So really in the beginning stages of this work. And I'd like to just fill in with the research group, is this still interesting or relevant? Are these the right questions? And who wants to work on this? I see someone who wants to work on this. Yeah, excellent.
Stefan Matsmeyer. Yeah, I think it's interesting and relevant. The current version 0.0 is extremely sketchy, so it's difficult to make a pull request. There is not enough meat yet. A few things that come to my mind. It's a list of people who could be a problem, a threat to anonymity. It's not just the other party or the ISP. On the internet today, you have a lot of people who are, I don't remember the term used by Hrpc 6973, helper or something like that. For instance, a DNS domain name registrar or thing like that. So there are actually, the problem is that there are a lot of people who can be a threat against anonymity, and this has to be an important thing in the next version of the draft.
I'm happy to also to hand over this draft. So would Stefan and Joe, would you be interested to put some more meat on that and pull that effort? Yes, wow, that's so nice. Please come in, next question.
Hi, my name's Manu Sporny. This work is really important for some work that we're doing over at the World Wide Web Consortium. There's a new working group that we're trying to form around verifiable claims. So these are things like digital driver's license, digital passport. That's as things can get as hairy as that. We want to do anonymous or pseudonymous over the age of 18, over the age of 21 claims as well. One of the mandates that we think the charter is going to have is we have to do a very in-depth security and privacy analysis on the technology because of all the scary things that could come about as a result of the work that we're doing. And as a result of that, we need documents like this to guide that process. Not only do we need documents like this, we need people from this group to engage us very heavily over the next 2 years as we put that specification together, because we do not want to get it wrong. So the question is, what is the best way for us to collaborate with this group? It's 57 companies that have signed on to the charter. So how do we get the output of this group involved with the W3C and vice versa?
Well, it seems that you got a bit more resources than us working on this. So it would be great if you could help us write the draft.
We would be very happy to collaborate. The number of resources to throw at privacy and security is always slim, right? So we have the same kind of problem. We have a lot of people thinking about deployments, not as many people thinking about ethics and privacy considerations. So we want to make sure that maybe together the two groups can help each other out. We can help revise some of these drafts, and you can help do reviews on the specification as it goes through the process.
As a co-chair, I think we should collaborate on that and meet online and see.
Fantastic, thank you.
This is your co-chair speaking. I think this would be Aubrey speaking. This would be a really good thing to follow up on and figure out how we can actually affect the work together. So, just want to agree with that and offer to get involved in that. Thanks.
Excellent. So now I'd like to hand over to Gisela Perez da Hacha. Gisela, please come in.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Gisela.
Can you hear me and see me well?
We hear you, and yes, excellent. Hi.
Perfect. Hi. Thank you very much, Niels, for the invitation. Well, I am Gisela Perez. I'm from Mexico. Nice to meet you all. I will be presenting on the draft that I've been working on with Niels about freedom of association and internet infrastructure. Next, please. So this work came up in earlier discussions during Hrpc when we were thinking about, it was agreed that denial of service attacks were not a legitimate way of protesting using internet architecture. So this made us think what would be appropriate and legitimate ways to protest using internet architecture. Next, please. To approach this in a systematized way, we went with this objective. We wanted to document forms of protest And that quickly evolved to collective expressions in general. I will explain more on this later, but the main goal was to think about these actions that did not have a negative impact on internet architecture, as I was saying earlier. Next, please. So this was our central question to implement the objective. How does internet architecture enable or inhibit freedom of association and assembly? This builds on other research drafts and deepens the understanding between association, assembly, and protocols. Next, please. Well, you might be wondering now, how did we go from protest to assembly and association? And then what is the difference between all of these three? I'm a lawyer, by the way, full disclaimer, so I needed my rights to be properly defined in order to proceed with this investigation. So the first thing was, as I was telling you earlier, our goal quickly evolved to analyzing and documenting collective expression at the protocol level, and what enables and what inhibits this collective expression. And this is also partly explained because the difference between assembly, association, and protest is a difference merely of degree, we could say. An assembly is it's a much more informal, temporal gathering. Think about demonstrations, sit-ins, rallies. Then also, of course, protest is encompassed in the right to assembly. But the difference between one and the other, and I hope I don't make this very confusing, is that protest can also be exercised individually and always has a component of dissent, right? And then assembly, I'm still on the last one, sorry. And then assembly has a much more formal nature. Think about, I don't know, the creation of collectives to pursue a specific goal that it is well beyond temporary strains. Think about NGOs, political parties, trade unions, or even ISPs and the IETF itself. That's protected by freedom of association. Next, please. So what intersects in both rights is the protection of the possibility to join or leave a group of choice, and retaining, I really want us to retain join or leave, because this is important when we start thinking about protocols too. The forced association is also a violation of these rights. Next, please. So when we bring this concept to the internet, then the question pops up almost by itself. Can the internet itself be considered an assembly, or is it more like a cumulus of associations, or is it a big association itself? How are we going to approach the different networks and the different interactions in terms of these two human rights? Next, please. So to dissect the research into smaller parts, we are looking at the following cases. Of course, it's not all of them, so it'd be great if you can think of more and suggest them to us. We're still drafting this. So we divided into communicated and identities, while mailing lists, even after 45 years of the creation of the email, it's still very pervasive despite the use of social media. And it's one of the most important tools that enable collective discussion, resource sharing.
Gisela?
Yeah?
We have 3 minutes left, and if people are interested in these concepts, they can read them in the draft. I think your next slide is the most important one.
Okay, perfect.
What are we missing? What are forms of associations in the draft that we have missed that could be added to the draft? So if people have suggestions, please let us know in the mail on the mailing list, or come reach out to us after the session.
Yeah, exactly. As I was saying, this is not all of them. So we were just thinking about some. If anybody else has any more suggestions, we'd be more than glad to take them.
So sorry to cut you short, Gisela, but this is work that we'll be working on for the coming time. So we'll definitely put this at the beginning of the slot in the next Prague meeting. Thanks so much, Gisela.
Thank you.
Then we go to the other co-chair, Avri, who is a document shepherd for draft IRTF Hrpc research. Avri, please come in. Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be seen. Sorry I'm not there. Things didn't work out. basically just have one slide here. Been going through the research group last call on this, trying to follow 5743 as closely as one can. Basically, we had over 2 intervals, about 3 months of last call. There was a last call that was very extended, also pushed it out to some of academia and some advocacy folks trying to get more input on it. And we did get some, perhaps not as much as I would like, but certainly a significant amount. Came back, there were further discussions on some open issues that went on for a while. And then another 2-week last call were held to see if we had rough consensus in the group for publishing the document as a IRTF informational draft, and I believe that we do have that rough consensus to do so. So really, this is just a recap of where we are. I would have filed it, sent it off to the IRSG for the next step in the review already, but we were asked to sort of do a moratorium. So as soon as this meeting is over, I will be submitting it. Niels and I probably have just a little bit of 5743 language in the introduction or such to touch up. But other than that, I think it's ready to go. And that's where we're at on it.
Thank you so much for that update, Avri, and great to see you also on the screen before we end the session here. I'm afraid we don't have much time left for open discussion, drafts, papers, or other ideas. I think we have 2 drafts, we have some next steps, and I'd love to take forward any discussion on the list, but also be around here in person or during coming week. I see someone at the line. Please come in.
Sorry, Lee Howard. I don't think you mentioned that you'll be speaking at the technical plenary on the subject of human rights and protocol considerations. That's something that might be of interest to the research group.
Yeah. So if you just can't get enough about talking about human rights, we'll have a plenary topic to discuss, to listen, and to go into greater depth. So I'm looking forward to see you all again tomorrow. But coming time on the list, and then again in Prague. Thanks all very much, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all.
I'm Harish Chaudhary from NICSI, National Internet Exchange of India. So basically, there are 2 things. First, I